The sound didn't belong in a living room. It was the sharp, hollow slap of something soft hitting wood, then a hush that swallowed the chatter, as if someone had closed a door on the party. I looked down and saw the carousel cake my daughter had adored all week. Pastel ponies riding sugar poles collapsed at my feet. The spinning topper lay on its side, smearing a comet of pink, frosting across the floorboards. Balloons trembled against the ceiling. Someone sucked in a breath. Someone else whispered, "Oh." Nora blinked up at me. She was 2 the age when every wonder still lands unfiltered. Her eyes were already glassing with tears the color of the cake's rosettes. Her small fingers clenched around a paper flag she'd plucked from a cupcake, the flag now bent in a perfect V. The room seemed to tilt, and in the tilt there was a figure Therese poised above Nora, like a hawk over a duckling, a slash of red lipstick fixed into a disapproving blade. "Look at that," she said, not to me, not to anyone, but down at my child, a greedy mess, can't even behave at her own party. Her voice wasn't loud. It was exact, placed with the precision of a pin pushed through a butterfly's thorax. The words landed and stayed there pinned. Heat rose in me so fast it stole the air from my chest. For a second I truly wondered if I might faint. I set the cardboard cake base upright with a napkin, a useless gesture, and in the same movement I was already bending, scooping Nora into my arms. She folded in against my shoulder, sobbing without sound, a tremor more than a cry. Powdered sugar dusted her curls. I could feel the quick-bird panic of her heart hammering through both our ribs. "That's enough," I said. My voice came out calm and level, the sort of tone I used to confirm deadlines with contractors or call a delivery that had gone to the wrong site. "She's 2. Across the room, Julian had stopped talking to our neighbor and turned halfway toward us, holding the stem of his glass like a person trying not to spill. He looked between me and his mother, his expression the strained face of someone reading 2 signs pointing in opposite directions. For a long beat, he didn't move at all. Therese lifted a hand, not touching, only wagging a finger in slow emphasis, as if she were spelling out a revelation. "Children reflect what they're taught," she said, eyes flicking to me the way you glance at a fly that won't leave your lunch alone. "If she's unruly, ask yourself who let her be." Nora's shoulders hitched. "Mama," she whispered into my collarbone, and it was the softest plea I'd ever heard. "It's cake," I said, still holding the measured tone though. Inside, something had slid off its moorings. It fell. "No one is hurt." I felt the sweet, sticky damp of frosting against my forearm and shifted her weight to my hip, my other hand instinctively opening a wall between Nora and the woman who had decided unprompted this was her moment to instruct. Neighbors stood at uncertain angles trapped in the tableau. A toddler clutched a string of balloons. The stereo continued to hum a children's song as if nothing had interceded. Outside the windows, winter light made the street look like a painting of itself, white sky, bare branches, a crow coasting past. "I'll clean." I said more to the room than to anyone and brushed past Therese without brushing against her. The scent of her perfume gardenia with an edge followed like a comment that didn't need words. Julian stepped closer. Then, but not close enough to be helpful. He hovered an arm's length away, helplessness tugging his mouth. "It's fine, Mom," he said, but with the weak lift of a question. It's fine." Therese didn't answer him. She was watching Nora with the alertness of someone cataloging a flaw in a product they were considering returning. When she finally spoke again, it was as if we were all performers in her play. "And there," she said, "is the problem." I turned away before my face could reveal itself. In the kitchen, I settled Nora at the sink, rinsed her hands, let the warm water run until she calmed. She hiccuped again, then grew fascinated with the foam making sometimes bubbles in her palms. I set a clean towel around her shoulders like a cape. "You're okay," I told her, and I meant it as a fact, not a comfort. "You're okay. I am making it so. I am Mara. I am 33, a project coordinator for an architecture studio that mostly renovates old municipal buildings into spaces anyone can love. My days are timelines and trades and materials that must arrive when they should, and the small, heroic acts of people who decide they will do the thing well because their name is on it. I am good at smoothing snarls that don't look smoothable. I thought that particular expertise might apply to families too. I used to believe that. I met Julian in a bookstore that was hosting a fundraiser for the neighborhood literacy clinic. He was on the volunteer schedule, tall and slightly overdressed, pouring coffee with a concentration that looked like kindness. He asked what I was reading. I made a joke about buying the same poetry book 3 times over the last decade and never finishing it. He said a poem was meant to be lived with, not finished. The conversation rounded corners with no sharp edges. He laughed at the right moment. I had the sense of stepping into a space already warm for me. We dated for 2 seasons that felt like an interlude written in better light. He had that quality appealing in men past 30 of seeming already formed self-managing. He lived 40 minutes from his mother's suburb and worked late by habit. He could make a pan sauce without a recipe and remembered birthdays with little notes. When we married the following spring, it felt like writing the obvious ending to a story that had told us where it was going from the first paragraph. Nora arrived not long after, close enough to the wedding that people could count on their fingers if they wanted. I didn't correct their math. I was too tired and too in love to care. Julian was, to his lasting credit, the kind of father who learns how to do a swaddle and then does it better than you. He took the early bottles when I returned to the studio part-time, paced the hall at 3 a.m., scolded the pediatrician's nurse if an appointment ran late. There were days I thought, this is working. Look at us 2 adults doing the unglamorous thing and doing it well. The warnings didn't come like alarms. They came like wind at a window you forgot to latch small at first, then insistent. While we were still planning the wedding, we'd sit over menus and budgets and guest lists, and Julian would pause with his pen above a name and say, "I should see what my mother thinks." It sounded reasonable then, the way you might ask your aunt which flowers keep best in heat. But it wasn't flowers. It was where we'd hold the reception, whether we'd serve wine or a full bar, which cousins plus 1 might be an invitation to trouble. I told myself it was respect. After all, people who consult others are people who have learned to listen. After Nora, the calls from Therese slid into a routine of their own. She preferred video, and she'd tilt the phone so I was a partial figure in the background, visible, but peripheral. Still nursing, she'd ask before hello, "When do you plan to stop?" If I said, "We'll see how it goes," she'd hum in a way that told me the answer had been graded and did not receive full credit. If Nora napped on my chest, Therese raised a brow. I could feel like a tap on my forehead. "Letting babies sleep on you spoils them," she'd say, smile tight. "You'll pay for it later." We were polite to one another. We were always polite. It is a strange thing to be steadily belittled by a person who calls you dear. Once, when Nora was 3 months old and had discovered the glory of removing her socks, Therese watched on the screen as I wrangled a flailing foot back into cotton. "Shoes by 6 months," she announced as if delivering a decree. "Barefoot is for animals." Another time it was the stroller. "Upright, or you'll ruin her posture," she said. "You don't want a slouching girl." The word girl held a warning. Not a description, but a fate. Julian was in those early months better at buffering than at boundary making. He'd say, "Mom, that's enough," but softly, the way you offer another napkin when someone has spilled. He'd hang up and apologize. "She means well," as if meaning well. Absolve the scrape of being constantly told, "You are a woman doing motherhood wrong." I thought avoiding fights was the same as keeping peace. I let comments pass, and I watched them accumulate like lint in the corner. Work offered relief quantities that could be counted deliveries that either arrived or didn't. I returned to 3 days a week, then 4. The studio felt like a place where my decisions were not open to debate by anyone who had not shown up to make them. We kept birthdays small, and holidays simpler than catalogs suggest. Nora grew sensible and stubborn, the way strong children do, curious about faucets, delighted by measuring spoons, obsessed with the cardboard box more than the toy inside. I tried to narrate her world to her. Water as warm dogs say hello by sniffing. That blue thing is for holding pancakes. It wasn't philosophy, it was ballast. Therese, despite everything, could be generous. She sent a pair of hand-smocked dresses that must have cost hours and something like care. She boxed up Julian's old wooden blocks and included a photo of toddler him, solemn, near naked, tilting a block as if it were a book. It would have been easy to make a story out of those gestures and ignore the rest. Many people do, on a Wednesday. 6 months before the party, Julian came home earlier than usual. He stood in the kitchen with his keys still in his hand, that look men get when they have practiced a conversation and are now trying to make the practiced voice sound spontaneous. I was rinsing cilantro. Nora was in her high chair turning a plastic giraffe upside down and insisting to drink water from its feet. "My mother's moving in," he said, and laid the keys on the counter as if they were punctuation. I thought he was making a joke in poor taste. I laughed in the polite way you laugh when someone misjudges their audience. He didn't smile. Why, I asked after a moment that had no air in it. "She needs family right now," he said. "My father." He let the rest unspool in a few spare sentences. Separation. A woman from his father's office, shock and humiliation decorated his grief. "It's temporary," he added quickly, "until she finds her footing. You've said yourself it's hard to do everything. She could help with Nora. We could help her." He reached for my sleeve, then reconsidered and folded his hand around his wrist. "It makes sense." The cilantro bled green against the sink. I turned off the tap. In the doorway, a coil of sunlight touched one of Nora's curls and made it look gilded. I was not a person who made unreasonable objections. I was a person who managed difficult calendars and turned them into days that worked. Julian looked relieved when I didn't answer immediately, as if silence were the first step to agreement. "She likes you," he said, brightening. "She tells everyone you're capable. She says you're the daughter she never had." He did not seem aware that Therese in one breath could praise and measure with the same ruler. "How long?" I asked. "A few months," he said. "Maybe less." He was already moving through logistics, her room, the schedule, the mechanic coming on Friday to look at her car. "It'll be good," he said, and the words sat between us like a piece of furniture we hadn't ordered. I wiped my hands and lifted Nora from her chair. She tucked her head beneath my chin and patted my shoulder with the flat, trusting palm of a small child. I carried her to the window and watched the late sun slide down the street. Somewhere a neighbor was frying onions. Somewhere a door shut and a dog barked at the closing. "Okay," I said at last, because the kitchen needed an answer, and because in that moment I could not imagine a future made of anything but cooperation. "Okay." Julian exhaled as if he had been underwater. He came to stand beside us, the three of us reflected faintly in the glass. "You'll see," he said. "It'll make everything easier." Nora held out the plastic giraffe to the light, as if asking it a question of her own. I didn't take it from her. I watched our street, and our street watched nothing, because streets do not care who moves in or out. They carry feet all the same. I told myself that arrangements were only arrangements. I told myself I could manage a house the way I managed a project, with a plan, with notes, with the steady, invisible labor of saying what should happen and then making it happen. I told myself so many things that night, when the kitchen had been cleaned, when the sink had stopped glittering with cilantro, when the balloons had been tied back from the ceiling, and the world had forgiven us for the cake. When I carried Nora to bed, she smelled faintly of sugar and shampoo. I lay a hand on her back and felt the quiet push-pull of sleep. In the hallway, Julian was texting his mother to confirm, to reassure, to welcome. The house hummed the way a house hums when it is trying to be a shelter and has not yet been asked to be anything more. I clicked off the lamp. Outside, the crow I'd seen earlier settled into its evening branch and turned from street to sky. Therese arrived on a rain-bright Saturday with 4 rolling suitcases, 2 garment bags, and a hat box so pristine it looked borrowed from a photograph. She stepped into the entry and paused as if the house were a stage she'd commissioned. Her eyes ticked over the frame prints, the plants on the stair, the lived-in scatter of wooden blocks beneath the console. "Cozy," she said, which sounded like a conclusion drawn after a survey. Then, as if to help, she slid her hand along the newel post and announced, "This will need oil." "It sticks." I took 1 bag, Julian took the rest. Therese didn't let him carry the hat box. She kept it tucked to her ribs like a secret. In the guest room, she set it down beside the dresser and opened one suitcase to reveal sweaters folded with geometric rigor. The air filled with her perfumed sweetness sharpened to an edge. "I brought my own linens," she said, slipping a stack into the closet. "Nothing wrong with yours, of course. I simply prefer cotton that doesn't pill." By afternoon, the kitchen had acquired new labels. Therese's handwriting, Neat slanted declarative marched across the fronts of jars I'd always recognized by sight, cumin cinnamon thyme. She relabeled the sugar granulated and the salt iodized and placed both on the opposite side of the stove for efficiency. She shifted the fruit bowl out of the sun. She lowered the top shelf of the refrigerator by half an inch and then congratulated herself for the improved reachability. When I came in with Nora on my hip, Therese was already arranging our mugs by height. "It will save you steps," she said, as if she'd lived a long life, adding and subtracting steps for women like me. Evenings developed a choreography. I would set out cutting boards. Therese would move them an inch left. I would slice peppers. She would mention that peppers stain wood. Julian tried to turn friction into banter, but his jokes fell into the gap and stayed there. When he sat, his mother patted the chair beside her, and sometimes he went. "My golden boy," she'd say with a pride that belonged in a different kitchen in a different year. She asked about his deadlines and shook her head at the ones that weren't met. "They rely on you. People take advantage of the competent." He shrugged at the praise the way people do when they've been trained not to look greedy around applause. Nights stayed thick with small commentaries. If I showered after Nora slept, Therese would open the hall door just as I stepped onto the mat and say, "Night showers can chill you if the heat is inconsistent." If I folded laundry at the table, she would hold up one of Nora's shirts by the shoulders, frown at the stretched edge, and suggest a different method. She had a way of offering corrections as gifts you were rude to refuse. It took 1 week before the first direct debate about Nora. I buckled her into the stroller with the strap snug across her chest. At her size, Therese said from the doorway, "Too tight." "Prevents proper breathing." When I loosened them a notch to keep the peace, Therese nodded satisfied, as if we had finally agreed on a principle. The next day she found Nora bareheaded by the back door and said to me, "Hat." The day after that, she declared that Nora needed shoes indoors to avoid flat arches, and when I didn't leap to comply, she shook her head as if a small disaster had been set in motion. Video calls continued, but now they sometimes happen from the next room. Therese liked to speak to acquaintances with our door open. "Yes, I'm helping," she would say. "Young families are so overextended." She said it kindly, and yet it rendered me into a category that didn't include competence. If I walked in, she would lower her voice and pronounce me a marvel, and in that softened word there was the contour of a verdict. Julian was different when his mother was present. The competence that had seemed part of him thinned. He did that careful anticipatory smile children wear when they're hoping their homework will please. At dinner, he relayed a story about a pitch that had stalled, and Therese leaned forward, eyes bright. "Names," she said. "Who said no?" He gave her initials. "I know his wife," she said instantly. "I'll call her." "Not to interfere, just to clarify your value." Julian laughed and didn't say no quickly enough. By the time he tried, she'd already moved on to how men in that industry respond to a certain tone. Lower, she advised her son, and then to me. "He's always been too gracious. I took on more work because work fit inside boxes with borders. I asked the studio for another site walk and an additional client meeting each week. If it's too much, Therese said I can take over your errands." That sounded helpful, until she itemized what she meant. Grocery choices, childcare arrangements, a new budget calendar like she intended to be a second spine for our little household. Instead, I enrolled Nora in a neighborhood program 3 mornings a week. They had a small yard with a crabapple tree and a teacher who played the piano imperfectly but with joy. When I mentioned it over coffee, Therese lifted her cup and kept it there suspended. At her age, she said, 3 mornings is a lot for a child who still naps. I said she loved water tables and sand. Therese said sand was a vector for pinworms. And yet, the first day I set Nora's little backpack by the door, Therese photographed it. Backpack doorway light, and texted the image to someone with the caption, "My girl, starting an adventure." She could bless and undermine in the span of a breath. None of it was catastrophic. That was the trouble. It was all survivable, each moment divided into slivers you could hold between 2 fingers. But slivers add up. I set boundaries where I could little lines drawn with a carpenter's pencil. "Please don't rearrange Nora's room," I said, after finding the crib angled away from the window and the picture book stacked spine in. "It helps me to know where things are." Therese nodded and agreed. 2 days later, the closet rods were lower for independent dressing, which would have been fine if the hangers hadn't become a game of necklaces around Nora's neck. When I cooked simple things: pasta, an egg dish with herbs, chicken thighs that loved the oven and didn't need attention. Therese praised the results, well-seasoned, dear, and critiqued the methods. You crowd the pan. Once she set her fork down and said, "It's charming how you make do without a Dutch oven." When a parcel arrived addressed to her, it contained a cobalt pot heavy as certainty. A household classic, she declared, setting it on the stove as if consecrating a surface. On Thursday, she hosted bridge at our table. The first week I didn't register what 4 women, plus their purses, plus the conversation of long friendships would do to a room's air. The second week I left them a tray of lemon bars and took Nora to the park. When we returned, a note sat beside the sink in Therese's script. "We used your good glasses. Reordered on your behalf." I hadn't known the glasses were the good ones. I hadn't known they were mine to reorder or hers. Julian drifted between us, grateful whenever I shrugged things off. He kissed my shoulder while I rinsed bowls and asked about my site visits with the same curiosity he used to reserve for new restaurants. When I told him that Nora would start full day on Wednesdays, he brightened. "That'll give you space," he said, like someone affirming a sensible investment. Later, when Therese objected, "All day is too long," he raised his palms and mediated. "Mom, it's just 1 day." She accepted the compromise with the air of someone agreeing to a haircut she didn't want. Small pleasures held. The teacher at the program taught Nora a song about a laundry line. We sang it as we clipped socks with clothespins that pinched our knuckles in a friendly way. On warm afternoons, we drew with chalk on the stoop circles, within circles, a sun with too many rays. I watched my child kneel and make a world on concrete and felt the air widen around us. Then there were the tight hours. The morning, Therese moved the thermostat for the baby the night she complained that my shower woke her restless leg. The afternoon she told Julian in front of me that some women overcomplicate parenting with opinions. He shook his head in a dissent so soft it evaporated. When I asked him later to say more, he pressed his forehead to mine and said he was tired. I believed him. We were both tired. But fatigue landed on us differently. His was a fog and mine was a press. We set a date for Nora's birthday. I wanted a handful of children from the program, a few neighbors, a low table with paper plates, and a game involving bubbles. Therese suggested adding her friends who've known Julian since preschool. I said it should stay small. She said small often reads as sparse. I ordered a carousel cake because Nora loved anything that turned. Therese offered to make her a proper chiffon, then reconsidered, then said the bakery might oversweeten, because bakeries always do. She ordered balloons in colors that matched the hat box and placed them so they framed the entry like quotation marks. On the morning of the party, the house smelled faintly of vanilla and floor polish. I wiped down the kitchen table and cut strawberries into halves that looked like hearts if you squinted. Julian taped a paper garland across the doorway, then stood back as if evaluating a project deliverable. "Looks good," he said, and when I smiled, he smiled relieved to have found the right word. In the living room, Therese adjusted the angle of the couch to open the conversation. She set napkins diagonally on the sideboard and aligned the forks with a straight edge you couldn't see. Nora twirled in a cotton dress printed with tiny horses. She wanted to show each guest the music box that played a tune we hadn't yet identified. At the mirror by the door, she pressed a finger to her own cheek and laughed, half shy, half triumphant. I clipped a barrette into her hair and felt that private easing a parent gets when a child is joyful in a way that belongs to them. The doorbell rang bright as a note struck on glass. I went to answer it while Nora hopped beside me, palm patting my thigh in time with her steps. The first of the children appeared on the threshold, with a parent behind all hands and paper-wrapped packages and the polite rustle of coats. I welcomed them in. The room filled the way rooms fill when a party begins, small voices rising, a soft scuffle of shoes, a light we hadn't planned for moving through the house. Guests kept arriving in a soft procession, boots thumped at the matte coats slid from shoulders, paper-wrapped gifts made a neat hill beside the credenza. The room warmed by degrees. Someone started a bubble machine on the stoop. Toddlers chased the shimmering orbs, popped them with a seriousness that made their parents laugh. In the kitchen, I plated strawberries. In the living room, Therese redirected chairs by half angles and nudged a side table so that a lamp welcomed the eye. Time for candles. Julian called paper garland, fluttering above him like a mild applause. The carousel cake arrived from the counter to the coffee table on a silver stand. Pink ponies rode their loops around a central column, tiny flags pricking up from their saddles. Nora bounced on her toes, hands pressed to her chest. Round and round she announced to an audience happy to agree. Therese stood at my shoulder, admiring the symmetry, while adjusting it a fingertip to the base, a nudge barely visible. "We'll slice with a long knife," she said, as if she had been asked. "Small pieces. Sugar makes small ones shatter." She didn't look at Nora when she said it. She looked at me. We sang not well but whole, and Nora drew in her breath to blow. In that moment, a younger guest elbowed the table by accident, the stand skated a fraction, and the cake tipped with the slow inevitability of a ship meeting its wave. It landed on the floor with a soft ruin sound. Frosting made a starburst. Fondant flags went skittering like fallen dominoes. Silence peeled the sound from the room. Then a single breath Nora's hitched. Her lower lip trembled. One small hand reached for a flag and came back sticky. "It's okay, Bean," I said instinctively, already stooping with napkins. A child behind us giggled at the frosting splatter, then went quiet when no one else did. Therese did not bend. She leaned forward, a finger describing a tidy arc in the air close to my daughter's face. "This," she said in a voice meant to educate, "is what happens when a child isn't taught care." The words were not loud, but they were arranged to pierce. Nora flinched not from volume, but from the nearness of the judgment. She turned and pressed herself against my legs. "Stop?" I said without heat. I lifted Nora in one motion, her arms going around my neck with the weight of a small anchor finding its mark. "She's 2. Julian hovered 2 steps away, the smile he'd been wearing for the party drying on his face. "Let's everyone take a breath," he offered, hand floating useless. He glanced at his mother, seeking a cue and finding one. Therese clicked her tongue softly as if scolding the air. 2 is old enough to learn not to paw at a cake like a stray. Several parents shifted. One set down a plate, another gathered their toddler's hand. I saw the soundless conversations moving between them stay. "Go pretend this is a scene we haven't seen before. She's done nothing wrong," I said even to the room, to myself, to the child latched at my shoulder. Therese's smile arrived cool and managerial. "You'll find," she said, "that permissiveness writes its own consequences. This is Julian's home. We won't have chaos." Something slid into place in me, less a rise than a settling. I felt Nora's damp breath at my collarbone. I felt the sticky sugar on my forearm. I felt the exact space I occupied in my own living room. "This is not a conversation to have in front of children," I said. I looked at Julian then. "Please help me reset the table. We'll serve ice cream. The cake is irrelevant." Julian rubbed his jaw as if coaxing words out of it. "She did technically push the table," he said gently, like someone suggesting a helpful fact. "It was an accident, but Mom's just saying." "Stop," I said again. "Because there are 2 kinds of words in a house on a weekend afternoon, and only one of them keeps the roof on." "Enough." Therese drew herself up, chin lifted. "You're making a spectacle," she told me, which was a way of making my refusal into the problem. Then to Julian, "Ask our guests to step outside. We need a family discussion." A couple by the doorway murmured that they would come back another time. Another pair edged toward the hall. I said, "Please, take a cupcake on your way. There's ice cream in the freezer, too." My voice was steady. The parents looked at me, and in their faces I saw a kind of relief that someone had decided to be the adult. When the room had thinned to the 4 of us, the house went briefly soundless, the sort of quiet you get before a storm or after. Nora's hiccuping breaths counted time against my shoulder. Therese spoke first, planting her words like flags. "Pack a bag," she said, pointing not at me, but toward the hall where Nora's room lay. "You can go stay with your parents for a bit. You clearly need a reset." Julian didn't wince. He didn't agree either. He looked at my face as if trying to read a blueprint without the legend. "No," I said. I didn't raise my voice. "You and Julian will pack." They both stared at me, the same expression oddly like a family resemblance surprise grating into offense. Therese laughed without humor. Darling, she said, the endearment making a mockery of itself. You seem confused about whose roof this is. Don't embarrass yourself further. Julian found his cue. Let's not escalate, he said, palms out. Mom's just upset. Nora's upset. Everyone's, Julian, I said, and I do not know what my face did then, but his mouth closed. This house is mine. Therese blinked a brief involuntary flutter, then recovered. Everything you have has been provided by my son, she said, crisp as a court stenographer. No. I shifted Nora to my other hip, feeling the warmth of her return, and crossed to the sideboard. From the bottom drawer, I took a slim file, the one with the things that matter printed on paper. I set it on the console table with the quiet finality of a period. I purchased this place before I met you, I said to Julian. With money my aunt left me. We never commingled accounts. You know that because you were part of the conversation. He stared at the documents as if paper could be insolent. You don't have to, he began. I do, I said. I slid the top page into his hand. The deed did the talking. Names are either present or absent. His was not where owners' names go. Therese reached for the file, perhaps to argue with the font. I closed it before her fingers arrived. 30 minutes, I said. Essentials only. I will set the rest aside for pickup at another time. If you are still here after that, I'll call the police to report a refusal to leave the premises. Julian's eyes went a little glassy, the way eyes do when the world arranges itself in a form you didn't rehearse. You can't mean, I do, I said with no force in it. Saying the true thing didn't require force. Take what you need. Therese looked at her son, not at me, and he received the look like a command. Get my cosmetics, she said, and the blue sweater. Not the other blue, the one that isn't trying too hard. She turned to me and attempted a last arrangement of reality. You'll regret this, she said, but it had the faintness of a script line spoken after the audience has left. I took Nora upstairs, washed her hands in warm water, found a clean t-shirt with a horse she liked, sat on the edge of her small bed, and hummed the wrong tune to the right music box. She quieted faster than I expected, thumb in her mouth, lashes soft against her cheeks. When she slept, I set her in the crib and stood there for a beat, my hand on the rail as downstairs drawers opened and closed and closets made their opinions known. I went back down and put the ruined cake into a trash bag, one careful slice at a time, as if doing it neatly might return the day to itself. I wiped the boards until they did not shine. I threw away a pair of napkins and kept the rest. Julian came down the stairs with 2 suitcases and a canvas tote. Therese followed with the hat box tucked to her ribs. She paused at the threshold to the living room, scanned it like a general surveying ground she didn't intend to hold, and made a sound from the back of her throat that could have been a dismissal or a farewell. Keys, I said. Julian patted his pocket, as if hoping not to find them, then set them on the table. He looked around as if the house might spoke up for him. It did not. I'll be in touch about, he started. I shook my head once. Not tonight. He nodded because there was nothing else to do. The door opened. Rain whispered. Suitcases bumped the front steps like tired animals. I stood at the window long enough to see their silhouettes slide into the car and the car's lights lift onto the street. When they were gone, the house breathed the way a house breathes when it has shed a weight, quiet, not triumphant, simply itself. I washed my hands. The smell of sugar finally left my skin. In the hallway, a single balloon bobbed at shoulder height, its string tugging lightly at the air, as if the room were a lake, and it had found a small, steady current. After the car turned the corner and the street took back its quiet, the house presented itself the way a room does when company leaves chairs slightly off a ribbon under the couch, a single paper plate inverted like a small white hat. I tied the drifting balloon to a drawer pull and opened windows to let the sweet cloying air dilute. Upstairs, Nora slept on her side, sockless, one heel pressed to the crib rail, as if measuring the room. I lay on the rug beside her for a while and watched the pattern of light inch across the wall. When I stood, the imprint of the weave stayed on my cheek. The night had its practicals. I slid the chain on the door, checked the back latch, wrote 3 lines on a notepad I kept with the house papers time, who left the reason that would later read like a summary and not like a scene. I placed the file back in the drawer and shut it with an ordinary click. In the kitchen, I filled the sink and soaked the serving knife so the frosting would lift without a scrape. When I finally slept, it was the early kind, dense and without pictures. By morning, the house sounded like itself again, heat ticking in the vents. A neighbor's radio describing the weather, the light on the stair making a slash across the landing. Nora woke with hair aloft in a halo and announced pancake, as if all days could be reconciled by the right arrangement of flour and heat. We shared one at the counter, then two. Maple syrup made a map of her chin, and I did not correct it. The doorbell stayed still. The phone vibrated once, twice, a third time, then quieted. I turned it face down on the mantel. On Monday, I brought the notepad and the file to an attorney whose name I had copied from a colleague's email signature, Amaya Lynn, who looked over the deed and the line about separate finances and nodded with the particular nod of a person who appreciates neat packets. Her office was spare of ficus, a watercolor of a courthouse, a dish of paper clips like small silver fish. I gave her the timeline I'd kept without knowing I was keeping one notes from pediatric appointments, dates of calls that left me steady, or not small sentences about the temperature of a room. She asked questions without leaning into them, and I answered without embellishment. We talked about dissolving a marriage that had not dissolved itself, and about custody that keeps a child from being tugged like a rope. There are orders that exist to hold the structure in place while people sort the rest, she said. You don't need to call them anything heavier than what they are, temporary. I signed a retainer and left with a list that felt less like a plan than like a sequence. Outside the courthouse dome shone the indifferent way buildings shine when the sun decides to come out. That afternoon, Julian called with the tone people use when they've rehearsed a reasonable voice. He wanted to come by and talk. I said the house was not for talking. He tried again, softer, and then pivoted. We need to figure out living arrangements, as if pluralizing the problem would make it communal. I told him I would lease the house at market rate through the end of the year, month to month, and I would send a standard agreement. No subtenants, I added, and no guest stays longer than 3 nights, explicitly excluding your mother from overnight. You can't be serious, he said, and then catching himself. That came out wrong. 3,000 is market, I said. 3,300 is what I'll accept from you given the where when family is involved. The number sat between us like furniture he had not ordered. He made a sound between a laugh and a sigh. You're charging me more because I'm me. I'm charging you more because I'm me, I said. I like my floors. He hung up kindly, if hanging up can be kind. 2 hours later, he sent a message insisting the number was absurd. I replied with a copy of comparable rents within 6 blocks and a photo of the refinished oak. The next morning, Amaya filed for separation and asked the court for a temporary schedule that kept Nora in her own bed and her own routine. The papers served as their own kind of lullaby, formal phrases making offense. A date arrived for a mediation in 2 weeks' time. I circled it in the calendar like a dentist appointment. Hotel life turned them into people I could observe without participating. I learned this in the mediator's waiting room, where I sat in a chair that had been selected to look patient and watched them cross the threshold 10 minutes late. Julian's collar was misbuttoned. Therese carried the immaculate hat box as if the hotel required proof of standards. She spoke first to him, not to me. You didn't bring the receipts, as if receipts were the hinge on which the morning swung. He flinched in the relieving way plants do when you move them from shade to sun too fast. The mediator Klein with a pen, he tapped without noticing, invited us into a room in which the art had been chosen to offend no one. He described the morning as a chance to reduce friction. He talked about calendars the way one talks about waterways, currents, crossings, low tides. We were to state needs instead of positions. Amaya did so with economy. Nora wakes at 7, naps, at 1 eats without debate when the food appears on a blue plate. Overnights break that. Neutral site visits keep the child from being used as a tour between allegiances. Klein nodded the nod of men assigned to balance scales. He asked Julian for his view. Julian offered phrases about fairness that looked good written down. When Klein asked about the presence of extended family during visits, Julian hesitated, and Therese filled the pause. I am extended family, as if the category were a pass. Amaya said without widening her eyes, third-party contact will be limited to the child's parents during the temporary period. Klein wrote the sentence slowly, as if watching it settle. We took breaks. In one, I stood by the window and watched a delivery truck reverse into a narrow space with the particular courage of drivers who know their vehicle. In another, I overheard Therese ask her son if he'd ironed his shirt with anything but his hands. He apologized to her for the day as if he were responsible for time itself. When Klein returned, he looked at me once as if confirming that I had also heard the rehearsal of their roles. We left with a temporary order: daytime visits at a family center 2 Saturdays a month. No overnights, a line about respectful communication that would look good framed. Julian tried to meet my eyes by the elevator. I looked at the changing numbers. I rented the house to a music teacher and a night shift nurse who arrived with 2 sturdy bookshelves and a ficus that had survived 3 apartments. They signed a lease without looking for tricks in the margins and slipped off their shoes at the door out of habit. Their toddler, a boy with hair like Nora's after sleep, patted the baseboard with the focused delight of the very young. When I handed over the keys, the rooms looked relieved to be asked to do only one job. Nora and I moved to a 3rd-floor walk-up 2 blocks from my parents. The ceilings were low, and the light came in at an angle that made every afternoon look like late summer. From the kitchen window, we could see the bus stop and the high school track, where in the evenings a woman in a neon jacket jogged in long, patient ovals. I brought 2 chairs, a table that fit only if you respected the geometry, a rug I had once considered too small. The first night, Nora stood in the center of the bedroom and named the furniture like friends, work adjusted to fit the shape of our days. I shifted to 4 days a week. On Wednesdays, I walked job sites with a white hard hat and a clipboard that had been dropped so many times its edge looked softened. We converted an old tax office into a clinic with glass that caught the sky without turning it into glare. We chose tile that would tolerate the indignities of weather and still clean to a respectable shine. The superintendent called me boss in the teasing equal way construction men use when they're acknowledging your insistence without resenting it. On visit Saturdays, I brought Nora to the family center with a backpack that contained a snack in a blue box and an extra sweater just in case. The room had the blank kindness of spaces designed by committee soft chairs, a low shelf of toys worn to satin, a clock with a second hand that made no sound. Julian would arrive with a stuffed animal purchased recently enough to smell like a store. He was careful with her. He had always been careful. They colored. They stacked blocks. Once he brought a book about horses with photographs so glossy, Nora stroked the page. Near the end of an hour, Therese called his phone. He answered without looking at the screen and said, "I'll call you back," and then did not put the phone face down. Another Saturday, he canceled that morning a message sent with 3 exclamation points, as if urgency counted as consideration. The center coordinator wrote it on the form and apologized to me for rules she had not made. Nora and I went to the park instead and watched a man blow giant bubbles with 2 sticks and a string. They rose and burst and left a mist you only felt if you stood just under it. Amaya's papers became a decree on a day that arrived like any other. There was a courtroom with an echo, a judge whose robe carried the faint pressure of starch, an exchange of yeses that sounded like acknowledgments more than agreements. The order gave me sole decision-making and the kind of schedule that respects nap times. It gave Julian the center hours we had been using. It did not mention Therese. No document needed to. I did not celebrate. That night, I tucked Nora into a bed with a horse quilt sewn by my mother, who pretends the needle doesn't prick her fingers because my father still worries when she bleeds. We sang the laundry line song in a whisper, because whispering is the only register nursery rhymes except after dark. When Nora asked again, I said yes once and that was sufficient. The house I no longer slept in became a line item that steadied the column. Rent arrived by transfer. I photographed the check stub and filed it the way I file everything now, with the understanding that paper can be a friend. The tenants texted me a photo of the ficus by the window thriving. They sent another of their son under the table with a book. You could see only his socks and the corners of the pages. I replied with thanks and no commentary. Small rituals took the space big ones had occupied. On Fridays, we bought apples from the woman on the corner who knows which varieties resist bruising. We drew a map of our block in chalk and let the rain revise it. On bad weather afternoons, we lined up Nora's toy horses on the windowsill and named them after clouds. My parents came on Sunday with a casserole shaped by the dish that holds it and my father's stories about buses he drove when I was a child. They admired the track runner as if she were ours. Julian kept his visits for a while with the attention of a person maintaining a small garden. Sometimes he arrived late and apologized. Sometimes he arrived on time and repeated the apology as a habit of speech. He stopped asking about the house. He sent 2 messages about a coat Nora had outgrown. I thanked him for the thought and donated the coat to the clinic we were finishing, where a box near the door grew full of things children had outgrown, but we still remember buying. In late spring, a crow made a home on the antenna of the building across from ours. At dusk, it arranged itself the way crows do, more silhouette than bird, and watched the block without intervening. Nora waved to it from the window and announced, "Our bird with the proprietary joy of a child claiming the moon." I told her, "Crows remember faces," and she held mine between her hands and said, "Remember me as if there were any other choice." On the evening that turned the longest lay into summer, the air moved like a slow river through the apartment. Nora fell asleep early, curled on her side thumb, gone still. I wiped down the table with a cloth that smelled faintly of lemon and set out tomorrow's blue plate, because mornings run smoother when objects are already where they intend to be. I sat by the window a long time and listened to the building breathe, the upstairs neighbor coughing, once the pipe ticking as the water found its resting temperature, the low drum of tires on the avenue. The crow shifted, then settled again. The balloon from the party had deflated by then, string tangled around the drawer, pull the latex puckered into a small, softened heart. I untied it and placed it in the trash, then washed my hands and turned out the kitchen light. The room held its shape. The night held. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. I'll see you next time as we continue exploring more journeys and lessons together.